You're listening to Accelerating Careers in Real Estate with Nick Carman, brought to you by MacDonald & Company. So welcome back to another episode of Accelerating Careers in Real Estate. I'm your host, Nick Carman. I'm white, I'm male, I'm aged 41 years old, and today that's relevant. I'm a line manager, I've been a hiring manager throughout my career, and I find topics of diversity, equity and inclusion difficult. So when I wanted to be a better ally and advocate, I thought what better way than to learn from the leading voices regarding these topics across our industry. So over the course of the next two episodes, you'll hear from the leading voices across our industry talking about how to be a more confident ally.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Sue Brown. I run an organisation called Real Estate Balance, which is about getting more senior women, more people of colour and more people from working class backgrounds into the property industry. I've got three guests this morning: Vanessa Murray from the Circle Partnership, Faith Locken from We Rising, and Gafar Fashola from British Property Federation Futures Chair. I think in order to establish our credentials, we should probably all introduce ourselves. I mean, I'll start to say Sue Brown, run REB. I've got 40 years in the industry. 35 of those were spent in real estate comms, and I've worked on a lot of the big schemes in London, so Canary Wharf and Spitalfields, and not in Paddington. But, let everyone else introduce themselves. So, Gafar, do you want to actually go first and just tell us who you are and how you got into the industry?
Of course. My name is Gafar, and my day job is as an assistant development manager working for Related Argent. But in my spare time, I chair the BPF Futures Network. And how I got into the industry was sort of irregular. So I started as a estate agent after leaving college back in Nine Elms and Vauxhall. And back then, there was a lot of development going on. I had no idea about the wider built environment, and all I knew was sales and lettings, and that's it. There was a specific sale that I was trying to get through, and we were working with the developer at the time on Nine Elms, and I had a Saudi buyer, and they had very high expectations of what they wanted a luxurious apartment to be like. That meant that I had to build a relationship with the developer, go back to planning, and try and get that deal through. And that's how I sort of fell into the wider planning world, development world, and I was like, this is really interesting. I want to go for this. I spent painful months looking for an apprenticeship or some sort of way into the industry, and I was lucky enough to find a business administration apprenticeship through British Land, and that got my foot in the door, and I kept upskilling from there.
Yeah, I mean, British Land, Simon Carter, who's the CEO of British Land, is actually on my board. Yeah. And I think you were working at Canada Water, weren't you, which is run by Macariaga, who's a very good and old friend. Yeah. So they're very, very good at that. So, Vanessa, why don't you tell us your story?
So my story is slightly different. So I'm a chartered surveyor by background, and I've been working in the industry for about 15 years now. And most recently, I've been working as an asset manager, senior asset manager for Stanhope PLC, who are a developer. I had a slightly different entry into the industry in that I actually did a degree in music, which is probably the least useful and most unrelated degree.
I have to say, I'm not sure. I mean, I think I know a lot of people in property, and I do. And I know a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds. I think you may be the first music graduate that I've ever met in the industry.
I know. So, I mean, it is, unless you're tinkling the ivories for clients, it's really not a very useful and related degree. And as a result of that, I really had no network coming in. I have no family background in surveying, nothing. And I was very frequently the only woman in the room in my early days. And I really benefited from one or two senior female leaders who really helped me along the way. And that inspired me to create the Circle Partnership, which I founded back in 2020. And I now run that jointly with my colleague Kerry Moyers, who has a background in executive coaching. And we are now very proud to run the leading mentoring, networking and development organisation for real estate. We have 130 senior female mentors, and we specifically aim to increase mid-level female talent retention across the built environment with a view of increasing gender balance at senior leadership level.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something we go on to, but I think the issue about how you deal with mid-level women is fascinating, and perhaps it's not for now, but it's something. I mean, my background, my husband and I ran our own business for 19 years. We got bought out twice. I then chaired the Women's Network in the two big corporate organisations I went into. And, you know, the issue was we always got huge support from senior men and women and from entry-level people. And it's the same at REB, you know, huge support at CEO level, huge support amongst the next geners. But it's all the buggers in the middle, as I call them. So it's, you know, the fact that you're concentrating on those is fascinating. Faith, what's your story?
So I'm Faith Lochkin. I am the founder of We Rise In. We are a membership network for mid to senior level Black professionals, entrepreneurs and creatives. My background is actually in real estate. So I spent just over a decade working in real estate in various guises. So everything from valuation to investment and then landing in development. And I guess my route into industry, not too dissimilar from yours. I didn't do music.
Was it music, Faith?
I did Spanish and Chinese. So I did languages.
Equally as useful.
But I always had a passion for property, and so I pursued relevant work experience in order to get onto a graduate scheme. And I did the non-cog route. I qualified as a commercial surveyor. And during my time in industry, again, I kept entering rooms where I was usually the only Black person in the room. And that's what led me to set up and chair the race network at JLL when I was there. And then moving on to setting up We Rise In, which focuses on that mid-level, so mid to senior level, and supporting professionals in advancing in their careers.
Right, that's, yeah, well, as I say, I think we all needed to probably establish our credentials for why we're here. But can I just ask, what do you all think? Why has property traditionally been about white, middle class, sometimes middle-aged men? I think you, Gaffer, sort of started to suggest, you know, or even when we're just talking outside, is it because, you know, so much contact is made on the golf course? And I suppose the bigger issue is actually what we do about it all. But tell me, you know, each of you tell me, why do you think it has traditionally been an industry that has attracted white middle-aged men, middle-class men, actually? I suppose in that sense, I suppose it's not actually very, I mean, it's no different from financial services and other industries. And I mean, one of the things that I haven't really yet had the time to do at REB is look at how we do compare to other industries. But each of you tell me why you think that we have particular issues in real estate in terms of only attracting a particular group of people, or traditionally that's been the case.
I think from my point of view, it's so gatekept, especially by that demographic. It's something that's very lucrative, and it obviously generates a lot of income. It's a high earning profession to go in, but it's quite gatekept. You keep it within the family, like you sort of alluded to. If no one within your family background or your social circle that you know has an experience in real estate, you almost don't know about it. Especially when I was growing up, everyone around me who I'd look up to were either sales or lettings negotiators. So that's all I knew about property that you could go into. I didn't know about the building aspect of things. And it's not taught in most schools, in most state schools, that real estate is a profession. Finance, on the other hand, is you can become an accountant, you can become a banker. Those sort of things are pushed onto you. But the world of real estate is almost hidden from you when you're going through making those important life decisions, career decisions at an early young age.
I would tend to agree with that, actually. It's not so much that why is it attracting those types of people. I think it's more, and I can only talk to my own experiences, and I've got 10 years on you, so it's great to hear that actually you agree in terms of your route in from school. But I think there's a perception, unless you're in the industry, from an external perspective when you're looking into it, but I think people think of real estate as either estate agency or construction boots on ground.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I did too.
Yeah.
And I got into it in a very, and I know this is a bit roundabout, but I got into it in a very specific way, in that I, surprise, when I did my music degree and came out the other side, decided that actually I didn't want to do it. But I didn't know what I did want to do. And so I had to do a lot of exploring. And I went to a specific careers advisor who got me to explore roles that my skill sets and my values matched with. And suddenly this world of real estate opened, and I'm very passionate about keeping people in it. And obviously our focus is women at mid-level, because it's wonderful. Like, there are so many different opportunities, but I don't think people know about them. And I don't think that there's necessarily people are trying to prevent people from getting into it. But I actually think it's an industry thing. We don't perhaps realise that we need to do a lot more work in getting it out there to say, look, these are the opportunities, and there are lots of ways that you can come and be a part of it.
Yeah. We've got a very, very lively Next Gen committee who do annual surveys in the same way as we do biannual surveys as a senior organisation at REB. And one of the, all the survey work they do shows that we're very much a secret sector. So I think people, want their kids to either become a doctor, a lawyer or an accountant, perhaps an engineer. And that is because people just don't understand enough, I think, about what the real estate industry is about and how you can actually, influence. I mean, I love working in the real estate industry. And although I was fundamentally a comms person, I've, as I say, worked on very big regeneration schemes where you can really make a difference, but people just don't understand enough about it. Faith, what do you think?
I would have to agree with Ghaffar on this one. I think it's absolutely gatekept, and I'd go as far as to say in a lot of cases there's nepotism involved. People only really hire in people they know or people within their network. I mean, when I interviewed for a graduate position at JLL originally, the first thing the interviewer asked me was, who do you know in property? And of course, I didn't know anyone in property.
I was asked the same thing.
Right? And I'm like...
Yeah, for a different consultant. But when I first went in, they said, who does your dad know and who does your mum know?
Exactly.
And I was like, no one.
And this is why I say to our clients all the time that you need to assess the interview questions that you're asking when you're recruiting for roles. And I ended up not getting it. And the feedback was they thought I'd just fallen into property. And I was like, well, you know what? I'm going to prove you wrong. And then went on to do an internship at JLL. And then I lobbied for a job and Guy Granger actually set it up for me. So I ended up being on the graduate scheme, but I had to be persistent. And if I didn't have that nature within me naturally, I can only imagine how someone else might have killed someone's career or someone's hopes and dreams.
Yeah, I mean, good on Guy Granger is all I'd say. Yeah, and I think it's what's quite interesting. I think that throughout the industry, there are particular people who have really gone out of their way to do it. We were both at an event yesterday that EG were running, and Kieran Bird from CBRE, who's the CEO of CBRE, actually had turned up to see one of his one of the people that was going through the Future Leaders programme. I mean, he set up the apprenticeship scheme at CBRE, which was really good because he'd not been to university and thought you needed to be able to get into the industry in a different way. Yeah. And the industry, again, I think, is quite dependent on people that get hold of that and do that. So, yeah. So what are the best strategies for attracting interest in the property industry to the widest audience, and how can everybody contribute? Faith, do you want to go first on that one? Because
sure, I think
you went last time.
My opinion's quite contrarian, I would say. I think there's a lot of focus at the moment to try and diversify the junior talent pool coming in. I personally think that you are wasting your time and energy to a degree if you're not tackling inclusion and changing the culture in the organisations that are within the industry. Because ultimately, we can have as much diversity coming through, but they're going to qualify 2-3 years in. They're not seeing anyone that looks like them or represented, and then they're going to leave. And that's where there's that lack of retention. So personally, I think all businesses should really be focusing on inclusion and the culture within. Of course, yes, let's encourage diversity coming through, through the pipeline. But I think businesses tend to use that as a scapegoat. We're diverse or we're attracting all this talent and not really focusing at the issues in hand, which are the cases of unconscious bias, discrimination, issues that are within their organisation that's embedded in the culture. So, yeah, work on inclusion.
Yeah, I'm interested to sort of pursue that one because certainly at REB, we're very, very, very big on cultural change. And again, I was running a very big event with Savills, interestingly, a few months ago. And Savills, I'm at Savills again later on today, but Savills, I'd say posh boy agent in the same way as I'd sort of think that of Knight Frank. But actually, Savills and Knight Frank are doing huge amounts of work in this area, really are very, very, very strong on inclusion. But it's interesting to get your view on what inclusion actually means because, for example, when we were running this event at Savills, we were talking about, the hunting, shooting, fishing thing is very obvious. And I've found myself suffering from that I'm not a hunter or a shooter or a fisher because, that's traditionally, or a golfer. But when we did that event at Savills, there was a lot of women in the room and a lot of women in the room who had come from outside the industry. And the big thing that they raised was how much of real estate is fueled by alcohol. Now, on this, I am a big drinker, so I have to put that up front before I say it. And this wasn't a religious thing at all, but it was, I think, women just saying, so much of the industry is fueled by alcohol. Now, I'm not sure that we're any better or any worse than a lot of other industries. For like for example, I'm sure if you went into financial services or tech or something, you'd have exactly the same thing. But when you say about inclusion, what do you mean? What do you think has to happen for organisations to become more inclusive?
I think there's a lot of elements to it, but ultimately, to kind of, I guess, wrap it in one, is meeting people where they're at and making a conscious effort to include people. So I worked in the industry. I was in City Investment, very big drinking culture there.
Yeah.
2019, I gave up alcohol. I quite quickly saw how I stopped getting invited to client meetings. I stopped getting invited, like the network just kind of dissipated. And it's crazy to think that just that one element was something that, and I think it wasn't necessarily malicious, but I think in their minds they thought, oh, Faith's not drinking, she can't, she's not going to want to come. But I can have a good time without having to drink. So I think having that conversation, and in my TED talk I talk about being curious, so teaching your employees to be curious, to ask questions about people's lives and want to know about how people are living and showing up to work. That then leads to empathy, and once you have that empathy, you can begin to understand and accept the differences within the organisation, and that's where you'll start to see the kind of culture really strengthening and merging together. And so I guess practical things that businesses can do is investing in training and developing their hiring managers, their line managers, their senior teams. We do a lot of work with our corporate members by running reverse mentoring programs where we get our Black professionals to mentor senior white leaders and supporting them in really understanding the lived experience. Because once you understand someone's lived experience, you might be better placed to actually advise and support someone else who might be going through something similar.
So, Vanessa, Faith's just talked about opening up the industry. How do you think that we can become more inclusive?
Faith just highlighted really succinctly an amazing amount of points that people can actually use, and I think that applies to all underrepresented identities, actually. And I think one of the things you said was be curious. And funnily enough, I was making notes before we came here today, and one of the things I wrote was be curious. I think we have many well-intentioned managers and executives who I think feel paralysed for fear of getting it wrong.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I think that's a really important thing to note, because we have to assume that most of the people that we work with are very good people trying to do the right thing. They don't outwardly go out to make anyone's life difficult. No. And a lot of this is
for the most part.
For the most part.
I think I've known one or two deliberately gone out of the way. But anyway, that's another story.
But for the most part, we work with people who are good and are well-intentioned. And I think we've got to talk to that audience, because they're the people who are going to be listening to this podcast and saying, great, I don't come to work thinking that I want to be part of a culture that makes people feel less than, or they're not met where they're at. So for those people, I would say that actually everyone has a responsibility, no matter where you sit within an organisation. And I think one of the cultural issues we have is that people sub it out to the DE&I committee or the DE&I role. And actually, it's not for those people to solve the problem. It's for absolutely every individual who can finish listening to this podcast and make a change in the way that they're at. And particularly people with power and influence, because when you look up in an organisation and you see the values and the culture not just being spoken about on the website but being lived and breathed by people of power, it filters down. And actually there needs to be some filtering up as well. So what can people do? There is some low-hanging fruit. And just to add to your point on being curious, okay, what does that look like to be curious? Why don't you speak to somebody in your team, a trusted advisor, a friend, a colleague, and say, okay, how do you feel? How do you feel in our day-to-day? What more support do you need within the organisation? Now, don't take them for a coffee or a tea or whatever they fancy. Just find out a little bit about where they might feel a bit more supported and if you can do anything. It might be that you call in rather than call out. So, for example, I think it's quite an aggressive stance to stand up in a meeting and say, actually, you shouldn't have said that to so-and-so because I don't think it was the right thing to do. That's not very inclusive behaviour in and of itself. And I think it makes people feel uncomfortable. But actually, if you can make space for those people's voices to be heard and call them in rather than call them out and say, listen, is there anything that you would like to add? I noticed that so-and-so hadn't finished speaking. Perhaps we could just finish your train of thought and make sure that you're making those space for people. It will start to, permeate through the rest of the organisation. The last thing I would say is perhaps sponsor somebody. And I mean that it doesn't have to be in an official capacity, but what are you saying about that person when they're not in the room? How are you lifting them up?
Yeah.
It's really little things, and everybody can do that. And I think all of those individual items can be taken on and really move forward in the workplace.
Yeah, I think the idea of calling things in rather than out, I really agree. I mean, I worked in one organisation that they were very much into calling things out. And it was, I mean, I'm quite bombastic. That's probably understatement of the century. But it gets really unpleasant. And, I just don't think, I'm not sure it adds anything to, people's well-being by doing that.
And they don't need a white knight. People don't need a white knight to come and rescue them. They need space to feel like themselves.
Yeah. Gaffer, have you got views on this?
I agree wholeheartedly with what Faith said, and about we do a lot in the industry with entry level, and that's great. It's changed over the years. You see a lot more diverse talent come in, but it's that mid level when they're growing through their careers. And personally speaking, from my experience, it does become quite daunting when you can't find a route for yourself. And most junior professionals come to me and they ask me, so what advice would you give me? And I'm like, I'm looking for someone to give me advice because I can't see anyone that reflects or has the same shared experience. What I will touch on is what you said, Vanessa, about just that mentoring aspect and being a sponsor in a sense, because we don't have the same shared experience. But reverse mentoring has been something where I found quite valuable, being able to share my experience on the ground, my day-to-day life, how that impacts my work and how that impacts my vision as a whole. It's something that's been invaluable and has actually helped me find a route in this industry, or at least roadmap one. And I think also one thing that decision makers need to take into account is, if you don't have that experience in your personal life, how do you then bring that into the organization to help make it a bit more diverse and inclusive? If you're not speaking to people about their shared experience, I mean, look at the riots that happened a few months ago that was targeting minorities. That impacted people in our organizations, but were they spoken to? Were they listened to? Were they heard? Were their feelings taken into consideration? Because that would have an impact on their day-to-day work. But people making decisions may not necessarily view that as it's just another thing that someone else has to deal with.
Can I add to the sponsorship point? Because quite frankly, every single seismic shift in my career has been due to a white senior male sponsoring me. And in some instances, it's been very direct. When I was planning on leaving JLL, Neil Prime said, no, we're not having that. What role do you want? I told him the role I wanted. An hour later, Virginia was calling me, head of HR, saying, we've made the role for you. You can start on Monday. So sometimes it is that direct piece. Other times it's giving people the confidence, because what we find, so we run a leadership program for mid to senior level Black professionals. And what we find is that technically everyone has technical capabilities. What tends to be lacking is that confidence piece. And sometimes just having that senior person say, actually, you can do that. Yeah, why don't you go forward for that promotion? If you're aware that there's, a job or a role coming up and you think this person's good for it, encourage them to go for it. Because it could be that if they're from a particular background or culture, they might not be forthcoming. They're not going to be the ones sticking their hand in the air and answering questions or saying, look at me. So sometimes just being conscious and aware. So sponsoring can be covert as well as overt. So yeah, just being very practical and doing what you can, getting to know people, understanding where they're at, where they want to be in their career. And therefore, when you are in those rooms that they're not in, you can speak to them, you can advocate for them.
So one of the things that McDonald have said when they're doing interviews, people want to know is, what do you think the best investment in D&I has the best return on investment? So, and what age should we start to get to people? So let's start with you, Vanessa. I mean, in terms of changing people's perceptions about ED&I and the real estate industry, when do you think you need to start doing that?
Well, I think it's important to say that it's obviously important from every age, but have a look at the data. And to your point earlier, the data at the moment, there's a lot at the beginning on grad level, because I think Gen Z at the moment are looking at workplaces that they're going to go into and consciously making decisions around, is this a cultural fit for me? Do I want to be here? And they're much more choosy about that. And actually, I've got a huge amount of admiration for them being so discerning in terms of the places that they want to be. And I think it shows longevity in terms of perspective. Arguably, it's a very good thing rather than just getting in because you have no other option, which was the case when I was coming into the role, because actually I was coming in and it was a recession. So, beggars couldn't be choosers. But actually, Gen Z are much more intentional in terms of what they're looking at. So lots of organisations are doing great work at grad level, to the point we were speaking about earlier. And this is only on the gender diversity front, but I think it's also representative of underrepresented identities that we were talking about earlier. When it comes to mid-management, it absolutely drops off a cliff. And I think those are the areas where, from a hiring perspective, depending on the level that you're hiring at, you want to make sure that it's not just appealing when you're coming in at grad level, but it's appealing all the way up.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I think in terms of it being a secret sector, I'm not saying you actually teach real estate at school, because, I think the idea that you have a real estate subject is quite difficult. But I do think people understanding more about the built environment would be really helpful, because people just don't, the one thing about property, isn't it? Everyone is impacted upon by it. Most people live in, houses, or obviously there are homeless people, but everyone lives somewhere for the most part. People are working in offices or shops or whatever, so property's all around you. But I'm not sure what you do about that unless you make that sort of part of human geography when you're teaching geography. I think that sort of thing does need, we need to think about what we can do at school to just get people in that mindset thinking about it.
One of the most exciting things working on the Canada Water Master Plan that we did was actually engage with the local schools, and they were allowed to come on tours and do site tours. And I would have imagined when I was going to school, if I had the opportunity to do that at that level, that would have probably steered me in a completely different direction and probably looked at real estate a lot earlier. And I think back to your point about that mid-senior level, when we're talking about D and I think those making decisions need to understand what that means for their organization. It doesn't always mean, okay, let's diversify in terms of ethnicity, but how do we promote ethnic diversity into positions of power that can make informed decisions? One thing that baffles me about our industry is we say that we represent society and we build for society, yet these organizations don't look like the society or represent the societies that we're investing in or that we're developing for. And I think that that's an very easy win if you're thinking about, okay, what can I do in this space and to improve my company's makeup, and how do I approach that? It's, do I represent the society that I'm serving?
I'm going to come back to that inclusion piece, because it's very easy for organisations to say, oh, yes, we're doing work with schools or we're supporting the younger generation coming through. I genuinely think you need to be investing in the training of your senior managers, those who are making these hiring decisions. When they're hiring, the type of questions they're asking, get them to sign up to organisations like the organisations around the room. We always encourage people to come to one of our events, because when you are the only white person in a room full of black people, you start to feel uncomfortable, and you start to feel how black professionals feel every day when they show up to work. And that starts to change your mindset and creates that empathy. And those, it's not that much of an investment, an event here, an event there, just trying to get involved. So that's where I think the investment should be going. I also have a lot to say about the RICS.
I think everyone has a lot to say about the RICS.
Because, I said this when I spoke there a couple of years ago, they asked the question, how can we get more people in? I'm like, well, first of all, the fact that you need an RICS accredited degree to be a chartered surveyor, I think is nonsense, because anybody can train and learn to be a professional and get that qualification. Why is it necessary that we need an RICS accredited degree? That needs to go. More organisations need to offer non-cognate routes. When I started out in industry, there were only literally I could count on my hand the amount of consultancies that were offering non-cog routes. Now there's a lot more, but we need more of that. We need people to recognise that to be in real estate, you can come from different backgrounds. You could have done history, you could have done music, you could have done languages. When you're bringing all these different aspects into a melting pot, there's so many amazing things that we can create. And the last thing I'll say is just more of a tidbit. When I moved from consultancy to development, it was when I was working for a developer, that's where I saw the most diversity that I've ever felt and seen in an organisation.
Really?
Yes.
And when you're working for a house builder, though?
Yes, I was.
Because, my sort of personal view is that house builders are not very good at this. So,
do you know what? Going on site, yes, it was predominantly men, but it was men from different races, different cultures, different backgrounds. I felt so comfortable personally.
Yeah, I think that's also a misconception, though, only because that's the people that are doing the hard labour. I exactly am with you. I'm on site majority of the days, and I feel more comfortable being on site because that's where people look like me. But we're talking about how do we get them into the wider real estate industry, not just in construction, not just boots on ground. And I think that's still very much nowhere near where it should be.
Can I add one thing as well? Just reframing ROI. And I heard this in a conference that Property Week put on, an Inspiring Diversity in Property. And one of the speakers reframed it. It's not our return on investment, it's risk of inaction. And that really, really struck me, because I thought, actually, what are you doing? You know, there are so many little things that you can do, and we shouldn't be asking ourselves why. What's it going to give back to us? Everybody knows that more diverse organisations are more profitable organisations. You have diversity of thought. Like, we're past this argument. That's a given. So you're really looking at risk of inaction, and I think that's the more interesting point here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I think that's a really solid point. Well, I think all of you contributed hugely this morning, and really valid contributions to make. But let's ask the question, which real life event in your career have you reflected on and thought, I would do that differently, when you're thinking about improving ED&I in the workplace? Let's go to you first, Gafar.
For me, again, I'm still very junior in the industry, and one thing I'm trying to do is give as much advice to the people that are coming into the industry that look like me, is to just, I think, more places where I can feel comfortable and speak openly is one thing. We all have different lived experiences, and I remember a lot of organizations around the death of George Floyd were saying, oh, we're going to do this quite different. They updated their strategies on D&I. What has come out of that? I would have personally looked and focused on, the minute that happened, improving the work that we do as an organization to cater for the society we serve. That's all I can say. And it's really that human element and that empathy element of understanding your privilege, understanding how better off you are. And it's so hard to put it into context of that privilege, what that privilege actually means. But it's almost literally going to work and not feeling like you don't belong.
Yeah. Same question for you, Faith?
I think if I could look at, I've had a lot of things happen to me, particularly in my career, but there's one particular story that I always say. So when I was selling Blackfriars Crown Court, I was the surveyor that was tasked with going down and doing all of the inspections and viewings every single day. So for a period of 6 weeks, I was literally going down every day, meeting these agents and investors. And every single day I was ignored, because they did not expect the agent selling this £64.5 million building to look like me. And I always had to insert myself. So I think in that there was actually one instance where an agent jokingly said, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't realise you're the agent selling the building. I thought you were a defendant arriving at court. I was so taken aback, I didn't even know how to respond. I was, 23, 24 at the time. I just thought, do you know what, let's just go in, we're here to do a job, let's sell the building. But on reflection, looking back, if I had, I guess, the tools and the confidence that I have now, and the tools that we teach our Black professionals that come on our leadership program on how to handle these microaggressions that you experience every day, I probably would have said something, and I would have called him out in that moment. Because sometimes, I appreciate the point about calling in over calling out, but sometimes you have to call out.
It's situation appropriate.
Exactly.
I'm raging for you.
Yeah.
I mean, when was that? So that was what?
That was 2019.
Bloody hell.
Yeah.
God.
So it wasn't even that long ago.
5 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, that is amazing. I mean, that's a bit like, when you're a woman, always being in meetings and people expect you to serve the tea or coffee.
Yeah.
And I always remember, as I got more and more and more senior in my particular roles, I actually used to make a point of serving the tea or coffee and say, oh, I'll do this, shall I, because I'll be mum, and actually sort of just throwing it back at people and taking the piss, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that is quite something.
But I wouldn't change it, because that put the fuel in my belly, to be like, actually, no, this is not okay. How do I help others like me who are going through this experience?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely incredible. Vanessa, what about you? What sort of real life event would you do differently?
So I thought quite long and hard about this question, actually. And to answer in a roundabout way, I was reading an article recently from Harvard Business Review about the way that men and women, as mentors, mentor male and female junior professionals.
interesting.
And actually, what they were saying was, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman mentoring a man or a woman, typically females are mentored on confidence and stepping into space, and males are mentored on commercial awareness and financial acumen. And I had to have a bit of a look at myself and say, actually, do I do that? Do I automatically assume that women need more mentoring on confidence? And actually, what I would do differently is when people say, and we do hear a lot of the time, especially on the Circle Academy, which is the program that we run for mid-level women, we hear all the time women saying, I need to work on my confidence. And I wish what I'd done differently is interrogate where that comes from.
Yeah.
Because actually, if you are the only woman in the room and you've never pitched before, your lack of confidence isn't misplaced. You don't have a confidence problem. It's just that you haven't done it before, and you need to do it a bit more. So actually, I don't need to mentor you on getting more confident. I need to give you more opportunities to be exposed to those things. And I think that probably what I would do is be a little bit more intentional in the way that I approach that mentoring and not just assume everyone's cut from the same cloth. I don't think that standing up in front of people is a very natural thing to do. Most people don't like doing it. There are some people who love it and love public speaking, but actually it's one of those things that gets easier the more you do it. And so I would be a lot more intentional in the way that I approach that going.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more interesting thing is actually, you know, because I've run organisations now for all of my life. I've actually been a manager, I think, for the whole of my working life. I was about 25 when I was put in charge of facilities, all the facilities for London Docklands Development Corporation. And I mean, that was an interesting time in my life because I had about 40 or 50 people working for me. And I remember one particular chap who was quite a lot older than me and was a postman, you know, was running the post room. And I said to him, what's your name? And he said, and I called him Fred or Joe or whatever. Oh, I thought you'd call me Mr. And I said, well, I'm your boss and I don't expect you to call me Mrs. Brown. So, I mean, you know, should we just leave it there? But it's quite interesting, isn't it? But I mean, the point I was going to make is because I've run organisations for most of my life, the point about men actually not being confident to go and do a pitch or something, I've known as many men frighten off on that as I've known women. But it's a bit like we do make assumptions. I mean, the other assumption we make, I mean, I don't know if you've both got children. I mean, I've got, you know, I've not only got 2 children, I've got 2 grandchildren now. But we do make a lot of assumptions that the only issue that women face in the workplace is about having children.
Absolutely.
And that is just wrong, you know. And I mean, Sam McClary, who is the editor of EG, you know, and a very good friend of a lot of us, I mean, she always makes that point. It's not just, and I think we've got to be very careful that when we're talking about women in the workplace, it doesn't just become about family. And equally, you know, obviously family responsibilities have to be shared. And that's one of the things I would hope has come out of COVID. Whether it has done or not, I don't know. Right, well, let's just talk then. I mean, the one thing clearly, all the things that we're talking about here, is we've already said that we come from a protected characteristic, although in the case of women, that's 50% of the population, but there you are, or 51%, isn't it? But what about being an ally? I mean, we're running a big Black History Month event not next week, I think the week after. But clearly, a big thing about what we're talking about AD&I and real estate is actually how do we want allies to work? What is an ally? How does allyship work? Have you all got views on that?
I do. But
no, it's a surprise in a nice way.
I think being an ally, I mean, is supporting, right? But I think it's not enough to just be an ally. You need to be a sponsor, like to the points that we were discussing earlier. You need to be actively supporting, not just passively supporting. And actively, again, can be quite, you know, overt or, you know, direct, or it can be covert, you know, speaking for someone or on behalf of someone, uplifting them when they're not present to do so themselves. So that's how I believe allyship works. And if to the audience, people listening, I would say the first way, if you're someone who's kind of really maybe a bit wary about what to do or how to go about showing up for others, try attending a Black History Month event.
Yeah.
You know, next month, there's so many things going on, not just in real estate, beyond as well.
Yeah.
Try and put yourself in rooms where you're outside of your comfort zone
Yeah, I
and
agree
meet
with
new
that.
people and try to just be curious, ask questions.
the event that we're running is very much about allyship. In fact, how do you do it? And as you say, in relation to this audience, I think that's particularly important. Vanessa, you've got a view on this?
Yeah, I'd say firstly, just know that your allyship attempts are appreciated by those receiving them. Don't be afraid to do something. And even if it's very small, if you want to be able to advocate and be an active supporter and an active ally, just do one thing. After you've finished this podcast today, just do one thing. Make space for somebody, call somebody in, show your support by being curious. It doesn't have to be these massive moments. It can be something that we all do little and often.
Yeah, I think the idea of doing a series of small things is absolutely valid. You know, you can achieve a lot. I mean, you can upset people hugely by small things, but you can equally make, you know, as you say, very much be an ally, I think, with a series of small things. Gaffer, what's your view on this?
I agree wholeheartedly with both of you. I think if you can get experience get knowledge from someone else's experience take it outside of work. And that's one thing I would advise, because even at work, not everyone's confident to share that with their boss or their line manager. But if you have people within your social circle, take them out, understand their lived experience. Like Faith said, I mean, that was such a mad thing for someone to say to her, but I could tell you stories as well. But it's that allyship, it's that someone's there to listen to you, someone that can actually influence as well. That would be my advice. Just be open and be curious. It's going to be harsh, but be willing to listen.
Okay. Thanks ever so much, all three of you. Really interesting debate. Thanks very much indeed.
This podcast has been brought to you by McDonald & Company, the global real estate recruiter. Don't forget to click follow and leave a rating to ensure you never miss an episode.